Selling internationally can feel overwhelming. Today, we talk to an Amazon expert who will help you simplify the process to expand your business to other countries. My name is Stephen Pope, and this is the My Amazon Guy podcast. I'm now joined by Kevin Sanderson, host of the Maximizing E-commerce podcast and a successful Amazon seller. Thanks for joining me today.
Stephen, thanks for having me.
Well, cool. We've got two freebies to give to our listeners today. We're going to queue one of them up right at the top of the hour and a second at the end of today's podcast. So the first one, Kevin is fresh off of his PPC pay-per-click summit, and he gathered some of the top PPC experts. So if you didn't participate in that, I'd recommend to our listeners to go check that out. You can get a free download at maximizingecommerce.com/Stephen. That's Stephen with a V. So, Kevin, I appreciate you joining me today. So before we talk international, what's on your mind this week?
Oh, gosh. It's like, I think a lot of what's on my mind is just trying to figure out kind of like what's next in the world. So, you know, as we're recording this, just there's an elephant in the room of there's been a lot of stuff happening. I won't get into, I think we all kind of know what's happened the last 2-3 months in the world. And so there's a lot of changes and kind of how that's going to affect things, both short term, long term. I think for e-commerce, it's pushing more people to buy stuff. And that seems to be not just in the US, that seems to be elsewhere too, because people have been kind of cooped up in their homes. And I think we're probably going to be seeing a lot of brick and mortar stores for a variety of reasons closing down over the next whatever time period, which is going to also push more people to buy stuff online. So it's going to be an interesting time period. And even outside of e-commerce, I just wondering where all the world is going, and what the kind of unintended consequences are. And it's just kind of my meandering thoughts more than anything.
There is a lot of uncertainty right now. And as you get up every day, it's like, hey, how do I grow my business is at the top of everybody's mind. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the things you would have thought of 6 months ago are completely different now. So I totally understand what you're talking about. So as we go to our international topic today, I'm certain that a lot of people will wonder, is now the right time? And what would you say, Kevin? Is now a good time to go international?
Well, it's that saying, the best time was, to plant a tree if you wanted shade was 20 years ago. So the best time to have sold internationally was already have done it. But the second best time
is now.
Exactly.
And so doing it now while most people aren't paying attention to it because they're, they got their supply chain woes or they can't handle what they're doing in the States, gives them a little bit of competitive advantage maybe?
Yeah, exactly. So, just to kind of peel away the layers of the onion with mine, so I sell stuff that got hit pretty hard. So my niche really got pummeled in this. And I at one point was, if you were looking at a 30-day window, 80% down year over year in the US. I mean, it's one of those things. That's brutal. Like, it was so brutal. It was like, I think borderline depressing to look at the app and see like when you're hoping to see green, you see red, and it says down 80%
Ouch.
Year over year for the same 30-day window. And it was during about the time when Amazon cut off inbound shipments, and all of a sudden I'm losing the Prime badge, and they're quoting people 30 days for delivery. Now that ended up not being true. People were getting it like in 3-4 days, but they're still quoting 30 days to give themselves some leeway. And like a lot of people, all of a sudden I have all these orders starting to stack up that aren't going out. So maybe those were actually honoring the 30-day window. And so all this stuff was happening in the US, but internationally I was holding pretty strong. In fact, in the UK during that 30-day time period, I had, I believe it was 6 days where my UK sales were actually higher than my US sales. And
wow.
That never happens.
That doesn't happen very often.
No. In fact, if you were to take my international sales, generally speaking, like in regular times, it would be whatever my US sales were, add like another 30 to 35%. And that's generally the range of what I see for international sales. during that time period, it was 76%. In fact, I think there was even one day I looked at it and doing the math, it was like 78%. And so imagine if I didn't have those sales, how much more devastating the impact of all those things that were happening in the US would have been. Now there's still impact. There's still, locked down the country and UK and Canada and all over the place. But the changes weren't as drastic with Amazon as they were here in the States.
I'm a big fan of this book called The Black Swan, and it's written by an Israeli guy who he indicts the bell curve. And he's like, unpredictable, highly improbable events are going to make more difference to your business than anything else, and so you should hedge. And that was his main thesis. Great book. Highly recommend it to my listeners if you want to hear a guy who's against the grain. And I might have read this book 7 years ago or something. Mm-hmm. Anyway, seems topical to our conversation right now as we look at the impact of our black swan called COVID. And
right.
And so you are in how many international markets right now?
8 outside of the U.S. So the U.S. plus 8. So a total of 9 marketplaces.
All right. Amazon. So run me through that. You've got the U.S., obviously, UK you mentioned. Where are the other ones?
Canada, and then also Germany, Italy, Spain, France, Australia, and Japan.
And that was exactly the list I wanted to talk about today. So you've got them all. Right. You've got them all nailed down.
All works.
Yeah, I've got one client that's in India, but I actually know nothing about that one as well.
I don't know a lot about it either. That's a harder one to get into.
Yeah, it might be invite only. It's not open, maybe not as open. So we'll talk about each of these markets and why to focus in on some versus others, and we'll talk about some of that prioritization. We'll talk about taxes and VAT and customs. Oh, these are words that make me... I don't like those words.
Right? They're scary.
And then there's this really cool acronym called NARF, which is not a Pinky in the Brain reference for those that have watched Animaniacs growing up, but that's for remote fulfillment. We'll talk a little bit about that. That's a beta program that I have access to. We'll talk about that. But before you tackle these international markets, there's probably some sellers that are like, should I even pay attention to this? You've just made the initial case that, man, your UK sales were bigger than your US ones. That alone, I think, should send a signal that, yeah, now's a good time to do this. But if you had to put a line in the sand or a bright line for listeners, how big should your US sales be before you go international?
Great question. And I've heard people debate this. I mean, I've heard people say like, oh, you need to be doing multiple 7 figures. I disagree. So in my personal case, I had 1 active product and about 4 in the pipeline that I was working with suppliers when I started the process to get registered in Canada to start selling there. And I would say it's an accelerant because if you think about it, it's all a function of money in, money out, and how quickly can you get money back out. So we're constantly trying to figure out how do we get more money out of Amazon, which is selling more quickly. If you take your products and you offer them in Canada, and let's say similar products to yours are selling there now, there's people that are going in and looking for keywords, just like the keywords they find your product now. And if they're buying stuff, but your product isn't available, some of those people would have bought your product. So you're missing out on sales by not having it there. And so essentially, Canada, I think, is one of the best places to start. I think I kind of rambled a little bit off of your initial question, but we can definitely explore that further. Well,
you did a podcast about a year ago where you talked about focus. So really, really good podcast. I might have to find a link to that and put it in the notes.
Thank you.
And although this podcast might be indicting the focus point a tiny bit because we're saying spread, shotgun, but nonetheless, that podcast, you talk a lot about making sure whatever you focus on, you go all in on it. So you're saying focus Canada, which makes perfect sense. It doesn't require you to open a new account. All you have to do is hit this button to port your data over, right? And the advertising is the same as the US, no differences. With maybe there's some mild differences that you'll point out.
Very mild, actually. And that's actually a really good point because, when you think about focus, a lot of times we think, I got to diversify, which diversification is great. Now, if you think of it this way, if I go into eBay Now I got to learn a new marketplace, new set of rules, new set of customer expectations, find new ways for fulfillment, all this stuff. So if you understand Amazon, you're still staying in the focus of the same lane. It's just like you said, it's pretty much the same thing, except the money symbol is a little bit different in the other countries, especially the English-speaking marketplaces.
We'll get some dollarly dues out of Australia, right? So get some funny money. That's a Simpsons reference for those that didn't catch that one. Cool. So let's talk about these dollar symbols and the sketchiness, or the scariness rather, of what that looks like. So let's focus on Canada first. If I want to launch in Canada, what's the very first thing I need to do?
So first thing you need to do is register with the Canadian government, and you can use your US-based company to do that. So if you have an LLC that's registered in Florida or wherever, or Idaho, you can just take that entity. You can even do it as a sole proprietor, technically. No, my disclaimer here is I'm giving my advice, my thoughts, I guess is probably the better word, both as a seller and someone who's helped other people, but I'm not a tax professional or an attorney. So the best thing to do is
hire an
expert.
expert.
If you have questions, hire an expert. And we're talking in broad stroke generalizations too here. So talk to somebody about your specific situation is really my disclaimer here. So on that note, you want to fill out this form to get registered for a business number, which is like their version of an employer identification number, or EIN here in the States. And you want to register for their version of taxes called the GST, HST. And that alphabet soup is basically sales tax that they add on. In most situations, what will work for the majority of sellers is to register with their federal government, which will cover most provinces. And if you're doing less than $1.5 million Canadian dollars in sales per year, you only have to file annually, which makes it nice.
And is that tax automatically collected, or do you have to collect it yourself and then file it?
Great question. So Amazon will collect it. And it's one of those things that as Amazon has gone more and more to marketplace facilitator states, less people are probably as familiar, I've noticed, with how it works. So generally, Amazon will only collect tax in any jurisdiction that taxes have to be added above the selling price if you put in your tax number. So if you go into Seller Central settings, tax settings, you'll see, like if you're in Canada, where you can put your GST, HST number in. You put it in there, they start adding on top of the selling price. And the nice thing about that is when you cross the border with goods, you have to pay GST on your declared value. And then you also, what's interesting is in Canada, you are paying GST on top of the fulfillment fee. So basically, they're charging you sales tax on the fulfillment fee. It's just how it works in Canada. However, those are both credits off of what you would owe the government. So if you collected 10,000 Canadian dollars in taxes and you paid, let's say, $3,000 at the border and $2,000 on top of your fulfillment fees, because Amazon gives you invoices for all that. So you've paid $5,000 into the system. So instead of owing $10,000, it's $10,000 minus $5,000. So the remaining $5,000 is what you would owe to the government. So in essence, your customers, if you're collecting the GST, which you're supposed to, will be paying you back for what you paid.
So that makes sense. And and to file with the federal government, is there a particular website, or can somebody just Google file Canadian business?
Yeah, it's like Canada.ca.
Got it.
You could just search e-file. They give you like a code, like a 4-digit number.
And any paperwork,
e-filing.
registration costs, or anything like that?
It's actually free to do, and just basically you fill out the form and fax it to them. And the
good old fax machine.
Yes, yeah. I hired someone to do the taxes for filing for last year, this year, and actually still did the calculation. I just wanted to make sure I was doing it right, because I'd been doing it on my own before, which I don't necessarily recommend everyone do that, but I'm kind of a nerd like that. And they came up with the same number I did. So it's
nice,
super simple. It's
good.
Not like filing IRS taxes.
So you're saying
convoluted.
Saying the U.S. taxes are a little harder?
Oh yeah.
So if you can do
this is
U.S.
actually very straightforward.
That's good to hear. Yeah. If you feel like you can do U.S. taxes, you can do another countries then. All right.
Oh yeah. This is super simple.
That's an interesting bar.
You still owe. Well, an interesting thing on that though is just remember your profits you make in another country, you still have to pay some sort of income tax. So if you are a foreign entity, generally speaking, talk to your accountant about this, you will pay on the profits to Uncle Sam.
Got it. Makes sense.
Yeah.
Cool. So that's how to deal with the paperwork for Canada. Mm-hmm. What's step 2? Loading product data?
Yeah. So there's these build international listing tools. I don't think they're as robust as they kind of claim they are. And I've gone into other marketplaces with Amazon's help, and I realized that they were using bulk upload files. So I recommend either, depending on how many products you have, either just manually adding them individually, add a product. If you've got like 5 and you've never done a bulk upload file, it's not worth trying to spend the time to figure it out. But if you have 400 SKUs, it's probably worth it to you to download the category listings report from the US, use that data for the bulk upload file to upload it into Canada, and then, or whatever marketplace you're in, and then upload it there. And if you use the same SKU number, generally speaking, you can use the same FN SKU. So that means you could most likely use the same labels.
That actually I didn't know. That's interesting. Mm-hmm. I usually do use the same SKU number and the same UPC, obviously. And if you load with the UPC, oftentimes the parts of the data will port over. Sometimes you'll even see the review counts from international markets also port over, though it seems like a mixed bag. Is that what you've seen too?
That's a great point. So it used to be, outside of the US, you would see your US reviews either on the search page or the listing page, although it wasn't always consistent, but it was always at least on the search page. And then once you had local reviews, the US ones would no longer be in the calculation of total number of reviews, and it would all kind of go down to the bottom. People could still see it, but they'd have to scroll down to the bottom. There was one day, I want to say maybe January, where I had a product that had like 85 reviews in the US. It had like 130 reviews the next day, and it was like a 3-year-old product. So I was like, there's no way I got 50 reviews overnight. I was going to put in like this mea culpa seller support ticket. I had nothing to do with this. Please look into this. Don't suspend my account for review manipulation. Then came to realize it was they just pulled all the reviews from all the countries together. So to your point, it's not always consistent. Amazon's always testing little things see how it affects customers. But generally speaking, you're not starting over from scratch if you use either the UPC or the ASIN to match it up. And then your reviews will generally carry over, and then your images will carry over. Most other components you'll have to add either individually by editing the listing or bulk upload.
So my team at My Amazon Guy, and if you're tuning into this from Kevin Sanderson's network, we've got a team of 17 out of the Atlanta, Georgia area. We do a lot of bulk file uploads, a lot of heavy to learn, that kind of data work, but absolutely necessary if you've got 400 SKUs or 100 SKUs even. I would still do it. So a lot we've learned there. Now you mentioned your nervousness about being suspended. Have you been suspended before?
Is there wood around here?
So even the pros can get suspended and gets nervous around these things. And it seems like everybody I've ever talked to has been suspended at least once in the last 2 years for whatever reason. So
it's like everybody has that like anxiety of the red flag. When you go into your account and it says like, account notifications, and there's a red flag. And sometimes it's like your credit card changed,
been updated,
or they just have an important thing they want to tell you. But it's like your heart kind of skips.
You're like,
what is this all about? What happened here?
Because my business could be completely shut off today, which is, by the way, and the reason why I emphasize this area is because this is another reason to sign up for international markets, because if you get suspended in the US, they don't automatically suspend your Canada account. They don't automatically suspend your UK account either.
Yeah, that's 100% true in most cases. Don't mess with Amazon.
Obviously.
But at the same time too, I had it happen to me in the holiday season a couple years ago where I had a product. It was actually my very first product ever sold. All of a sudden Amazon went on this whole thing about, products that were potentially hazardous, and it got suspended. The ASIN got suspended in the US, is flagged as potentially hazardous. There's nothing potentially hazardous about it. Well, it got fixed, but it took a few days, but it was still selling in Canada in the UK.
So we have had to pass the pesticides gating test for about 30 of our clients. Have you been down that path before?
Not on my own, but people I've worked with have had to do that, and that's a brutal one.
So if anybody's looking for the answer key to the pesticides gating, I may have that on my YouTube channel. Nudge, nudge.
Okay.
Link in the comments. And the only reason I do this is because I've never once met anybody that actually sells pesticides, but I have met more than 40 accounts, 40 clients that have had to pass pesticides gating. So we can get that done for you within about 7 minutes of effort, or you can come copy the answer key. Now, if you actually sell pesticides, please don't cheat. Go learn your thing. But there's no reason that those other 40 clients that got caught with the pesticides gating ridiculous bull crap would have to go spend 2 hours learning about pesticides. Like one guy sells tweezers and he had to pass it, for crying out loud.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I know someone that sells long sleeve shirts. And like there's shirts you would use for like deep sea fishing, and they had just mentioned that it could help keep the mosquitoes away. And I think that's what
any random keyword. It's super ridiculous. So we'll put the answer key in the link in the notes for any of them
that's probably going to solve a lot of people's problem.
All right, so we talked about taxes. Now, is that inclusive of all of the above, VAT, customs, and taxes, or is there separate things you got to do there?
So GST is kind of like VAT light. So VAT is what happens when you're in Europe. So we can get into that if you'd like here in a moment. But GST operates kind of like, if you go to the store and you buy something, it's $2.99, you might pay $3.24 or whatever the sales tax is, because they're adding the tax on top of the $2.99 selling price. Same thing in Canada. Europe operates differently, which whenever you're ready to get into Europe, we can talk more about how that works, which is a whole different animal, different set of challenges.
So let's talk about NARF, my little pinky in the brain reference, and then let's go to Europe.
Sure.
And so I'm using NARF currently, but I've only seen about 8% of accounts get access to this. So if you have no idea what I'm talking about, this is coming, and they were about to roll it out probably, and then COVID hit, so they kind of paused it. But if I had to predict by Q4, we're going to see 100% rollout for this. And what NARF is, and I'll let you chime in from your own perspective here momentarily, but what NARF is the ability to use U.S. FBA inventory and ship it and sell it on Canada and Mexico. So what's your opinion and take on NARF?
So NARF is basically, to your point, they're using your U.S. inventory to send to the customer. I think it's good if you have a large catalog of products, and maybe some of them might sell maybe one a year in Canada. It's not worth necessarily sending it up there. Generally speaking, with FBA inventory, you could be looking at 10 to 15%. I even know an outlier who's doing like 35% of his US sales he sees in Canada. That's kind of on the higher end. But NARF is basically where it doesn't cost you as the seller anything, but it's a different customer experience. And so it's one of the things, what was it, Zig Ziglar said, you can have anything in life you want as long as you help enough other people get what they want. And so in Canada, if you go on Amazon.ca and you live in Toronto or wherever you live, you can have stuff delivered to you if you're a Prime member in a couple days. And they've got lots of Prime members. You pay everything in your local currency. You don't have to pay for shipping. If you buy a product where it's through the NARF program, you're going to be potentially paying duties. You could be paying...
Who's paying it, though?
The customers.
Yes, so that's why I like the program, because then I don't have to deal with it, right? But keep going.
Sure. So if you're the customer and you're looking in between two products, one, you have to pay duties on, and it's going to take you a week or two to get it. Or another one, it could be delivered to you in a day or two, and you don't have to pay duties or anything crazy like that.
Easy choice.
Or extra shipping. Which are you as the customer going to go with? So it's all anecdotal. I don't have research on this, but in the research I've seen, people talk about maybe 1-2% of their sales in the US they'll see in NARF, whereas oftentimes people see 10-15%. of their sales in the U.S. they'll see in Canada.
If you'd asked me to quote numbers, I would have given you those exact same numbers. So I think that's a pretty safe bet.
Yeah. So it's like one of those things. It's low risk. If someone came to you and said, "Hey, you can increase your sales by 1 or 2% by clicking a button," why wouldn't you do it? So it's like, why not? If Amazon came to you. Now, is that the right long-term solution?
No, I would say
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think you need to have the inventory there long-term, but short-term, if you're stressed out and you're like, I can barely keep my stuff in stock and my supply chain's a wreck, and you know my warehouse guy quit on Tuesday, then NARF's a no-brainer. If you want to see some 10% lift with a little bit more effort and you got to do some paperwork, that's we're on the same page. Launch overseas. Yeah,
and the nice thing too, when you have FBA inventory, you're diversifying your risk too. So if you're getting, let's say, 10% in Canada, 10% in the UK, and 10% in Germany, just for ease of math, that's roughly a third of your U.S. sales. So you just cut your risk by about a third. I didn't come up with that on my own; someone else did. But you're making things more diversified. And so let's say you're doing roughly $100,000 a year in profit in the U.S., which if you're going to sell your business, the actual number they're looking for is called Sellards discretionary earnings. I learned that from Joe Valley from Quiet Light Brokerage. And the way he described it is, let's say at that profit level, you'd be looking at about a 3x on an Amazon-only business. So that means your $100,000 in profit times 3 means your business is worth about $300,000. Now, if let's say you were doing $100,000 in the US, you added on Canada, let's just assume the margins are roughly the same, so you add on another $10,000 in profit. Well, you now have $110,000 in profit, so you would think times 3 would be $330,000. Well, actually, you might, instead of getting a 3x multiple, you might get a 3.1 multiple, which now instead of 330, it's actually 341,000. Your entire business is now worth more because you were in Canada and a little bit more diversified. So just another thing to think about if you're looking to go abroad. It can be more attractive potentially to a buyer.
I think that's actually a really good selling point. That's pretty convincing and compelling, actually. So that's good.
Right.
All right. So let's focus over on Europe. And France shut its warehouses down and had a big tat with the government and all that good stuff. So another point of diversification across multiple countries is if something were to happen and hopefully it never happens in the U.S., but it could, right? Let's say they shut down FBA and say, hey, FBA, you can't sell non-important items. And who knows what their definition of non-important items would be.
Right.
But that's what happened in France, and they started fining Amazon for shipping. So most sales kind of went to a standstill unless you were selling a high priority item. But so yeah, what's your opinion on or thoughts on that? And then let's talk Europe proper.
Sure. So if you lose France, oh well. I mean, for most people, it's their worst marketplace in Europe. Mine tends to float between between France and Spain. France is usually pretty bad. So if you can get sales there, great. If not, don't worry about it. Is the way I look at it. France is like my NARF of
very good
of Europe.
Well played, sir. Cue the Pinky and Brain music. Okay, so the market's the easiest to launch in Europe, UK, and then Germany would be my next pick due to sales velocity. I actually have most sellers do better in Germany than UK. How is your take on that?
Could just be my products. I've heard a lot of people say what you just said. It could be my translations. I mean, I hired a good translator and I had someone verify that it was good translations who spoke German. So some of it just depends on the market.
Could be
your product.
Could be the competition.
If that's culturally relevant. Now, the good news is Canada is very similar to the US. I mean, they're just basically friendly Americans. And then when you get into the UK, they start using some different words and their culture is just a little different, but it's not that much different. Whereas Germany, it's still a Western culture. It's not totally different.
Yeah.
But there's, my wife was a foreign exchange student in Germany in high school, and she describes it as like there's noticeable differences in just how people think. So that affects how they buy things.
So in the UK, it's like, yeah, I've got my rubbish bin and
right,
and
or
vouchers
instead of Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
I used to work for a British-based company that came to the States, so they did the opposite of what we're describing, and they actually printed a 50-page catalog, and right on the front of it, they called it a rubbish bin to sell their trash can, and I was like, oh boy, guys, you just printed a wasted piece of toilet paper.
You need to put that in the rubbish bin.
So, and then, and by the way, get our 20% voucher code. Well, if you quizzed 100 people on the street right now, I bet you maybe 60, 70% of them wouldn't even know what a voucher is.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So there is some differences you'll have to be prepared for in language for the UK. Keep that in mind. There are some markets that have advertising and some that don't. So all of the Europe does. Singapore and Australia, as far as I know, do not. Advertising in Europe, advertising costs are generally lower from my experience, less competition. What are you seeing?
Yeah, generally it's less advertising cost as a percentage. Now, what you have to keep in mind, and this is where now we're going from, if Canada is like the JV of, value-added tax type system, we're now like Division I college in Europe. There's a lot of landmines. There's a lot of craziness. Please talk to a tax advisor, but please do your research before you talk to a tax advisor, because what ends up happening, I know some really good tax advisors, great people. They know all the ins and outs. The problem with tax people in general, and this isn't a knock on tax people, so if any tax people are listening, I don't mean this as an insult, but you probably know exactly what I'm talking about here. It's human nature, if you do something all day long, to geek out on it and like to talk about all the little nuances of it. So like you and I could have a conversation about Amazon, and people that don't do Amazon, or maybe they buy stuff on Amazon, they might understand a little bit what we're saying, but they might think, why are you even getting into like all these like weird little things? Taxes is kind of the same thing. And too often tax people are giving you all this information that may not even necessarily be relevant to you, or they're trying to explain something that might happen in some certain situation, which is good to know, but you need to first understand the skeleton before you start putting the skin on it. So one of the things, if you go on Amazon, they've got, if you look up VAT resources on, just go to Google, Amazon VAT resources. There's a page. I have to like look for it every time I go to find this, but KPMG, the Big Four accounting, I think it's still Big Four, the accounting company, put together this, they call it a VAT interview. And what it is, it's like a little quiz where you can put in different scenarios. So both in my own situation, selling in Europe, helping other people sell in Europe, and talking to a lot of tax professionals and doing this little quiz, I've kind of figured out what works for most people. So what I'm about to say, use this as kind of your skeleton when you're talking to your tax people about what is the right thing for you. So generally speaking, everyone that goes, if you're selling in the US and you're not based in Europe, you're starting out at one number, 0. So your sales there are 0. You have not achieved any sales, so there's no thresholds you've crossed yet. So there are going to be some situations where you're going to be responsible for registering and filing VAT. Generally speaking, that's my phrase here. So if you import into a country in Europe, which even though the UK left the European Union as of June 2020 when we're recording this, at least until the end of the year, possibly longer, a lot of these trade arrangements will still be in place. So if you go into a European country, you import into it, cross their border and bring your stuff in, you're responsible for registering and filing in that country. Then if you hold goods in that country, generally speaking, you're going to be registering and filing. Now, here's where it gets a little different than the US. In the US, more often than not, again, there's always the exception to the exception, the taxes, and I'm sure tax people can geek out on all this stuff. It's usually in the US based on where the customer lives. So I am registered in Florida. Florida is not a marketplace facilitator state. And so I'm paying taxes if Amazon ships something to a Florida customer. because I'm registered in Florida and I file in Florida. Doesn't matter where the warehouse was. In Europe, it's based on where it was dispatched from, which is basically shipped from. You know, like their version of rubbish bin versus trash can. It's shipped from versus dispatched from. So if it dispatches from a certain country, you will generally owe to the country it was dispatched from, and you don't have to register in, let's say, Germany if you're selling to people that buy on Amazon.de and they get sales that were shipped or dispatched from the UK. You would owe the UK government for the VAT on that until you reach a certain threshold, which off the top of my head, I want to say it's 100,000 euros in sales in Germany. So the way that works is, think of it this way from like a customer perspective. People will try to explain to you like adding VAT and all this stuff. Just put yourself in the shoes of the customer. If it says something costs 12 pounds or 12 euros or whatever the case is, that is what they're going to pay. There's no add-on 20%. It's included. So if you think of it in the US, if you go to a stadium or pretty much anything that involves cash, where it's like they're trying to keep the transaction very simple. Like I used to work at Walt Disney World as a manager, and my first job there was ice cream carts. And so basically, if someone came to one of our ice cream carts and let's say it was $2, we didn't say, oh, okay, that's going to be $2.12 adding on the sales tax. We said it's $2. Well, there was still sales tax in that. It's just...
But you're paying for it as the seller instead of the buyer.
Right. It's just included in the selling price. So we conveniently already factored that in. So you have to consider the fact you have a 20% VAT. And the way that is calculated is if, let's say, I use 12 pounds purposefully because the math is simple to kind of explain this. So really your selling price, even though it's not what it is advertised, nowhere does the customer see this. It's just you have to know this is what's happening. 2 pounds is actually VAT. 10 pounds is your selling price. So you almost have to take 2 pounds off the table. Now, just as in Canada, you pay when you go across the border a GST, you pay VAT when you go across the border into Europe. Now, Canada, based on my conversations with the Canadian Revenue Agency and tax professionals, pretty much the same type of documentation you could use to claim a deduction with the IRS. You could use the same kind of documentation with Canadian Revenue Agency if you were ever audited, because it's like, for example, you could just take your like if you use UPS and UPS gives you invoices, you could just use that to claim your deductions on the sales on the your credits that you're trying to get from your GST in Canada. In Europe, you can take that as a credit as well. So anything you're really paying in could be, well, there's landmines there, but generally speaking, business-related deductions, you can take the VAT and subtract that from what you're going to owe the UK government. Now, there's some weirdness with that. So there's what's called the C79 form, which is like the formal form. It's this really nice looking form. I mean, it's beautiful. It's very elaborate.
I don't think I've ever heard anybody say taxes are beautiful or VAT's beautiful, but please,
I'm
please
saying
tell
the
me.
form is beautiful. It's like probably one of those things like they don't want you to doctor it. It's very elaborate looking, like just the paper itself, and they mail it to you. Well, you have to file quarterly. Sometimes it may take 3 months for you to get it because, it's like going through, I don't know, Pony Express going across the ocean or something like that. So it just takes forever to get to you. So technically, you might not even have all the right documentation when it's time to file, even though you know the right. So if like they a week later decide to audit you, which I don't know if they would actually do that, but if you're trying to make sure you're compliant, it's harder there. So there's one thing I think a lot of people could look into. So in the US, if we were to use the word scheme to talk about our taxes, we usually think of someone who's going to jail. There, if you use the word scheme, it's their term for accounting methodology. So there's two schemes you can use for VAT. There's the standard scheme, which is kind of like what I was saying. VAT collected minus VAT already paid in that time period is what you would owe the government. So to keep it simple, they actually have what they call flat rate scheme, which is based on your industry code. So most of us listening to this would be online retailers. So it's 7.5% of our selling price. So 7.5% times like 12 pounds, for example. The math is not quite the same algebra equation, but you just basically take your total sales times 0.075%, and that's what you pay. So it's like, to keep it simple and bake in the costs. Now, if you're outside of Europe, most of your other business expenses are probably not VATable. And so you're probably not paying VAT on, let's say software you're paying in the US and things like that. So if you're using Helium 10 or Jungle Scout, there's no VAT on that in the US. I'm not 100% sure if you're based in the UK, but you don't have all these different expenses. So oftentimes it's actually, depending on your cost of goods and what you're paying at the border, oftentimes it's actually less expensive as far as what you're going to end up owing to the government, and it's simple. And you can do that if you've had less than 150,000 pounds worth of sales in a year, or you can stay on it up until 230,000 pounds of sales. And so then after that, then you got to start doing all the other formalities of standard and all that other stuff. But think of it this way. You start at zero, and then later on down the road, your tax people can help you figure that part out. But start simple and make it more complex. And also the nice thing is about the flat rate scheme, your first year, you can do 6.5% instead of 7.5% because they give you a 1% discount your first year.
Interesting. So you make it sound simple theoretically by voice, but of course, having this on paper would be helpful. So here comes our second freebie that we promised at the bottom of our podcast. Sure. So you have a guide that you've put together, and if you would like to pitch that, please do.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll get to the link for that here in just a moment. But basically, what it is there's all these little steps you got to take. So, the thing that holds people back from selling internationally is these hoops you have to jump through. But once you kind of put it out on paper, you realize the dragon's not as scary as you thought it was. So what I did was just to make it a little bit more simple of, okay, here's the general steps of what you got to do. I put together a little checklist. It's actually about 13 pages long, where I walk you through step by step. Here's what you need to do to get launched in Canada and stuff like that. And I've had people, send me thank you notes saying, hey, I was able to use that to get launched. I appreciate that. So totally free for your listeners. All they have to do is go to maximizingecommerce.com/mag, M-A-G, as in my Amazon guy. So again,
wonderful.
maximizingecommerce.com/M as in Mary, A as in Apple, G as in Guy.
And we will have a link to that as well in the podcast notes to make it easy. Kevin, it was a pleasure to have you on my podcast. And for those that haven't been following him, you guys need to be. He's definitely one of the top podcasts and top followers to be looking at for experts in the space. Please give him a follow. And for those coming from Kevin's space and you haven't heard of My Amazon Guy before, we're a 17-person agency in the Atlanta, Georgia area. We do everything related to Amazon, related to PPC, design, in-house, logistics, SEO, and more. So, Kevin, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. Well, appreciate having me, Stephen.
Perfect. For those that haven't yet, we recommend you subscribe to our own podcast. You can find us on Google, Apple, and Spotify, and many more. Thanks again. My name is Stephen Pope, and I am the founder of My Amazon Guy.